Good morning. It is Wednesday, March 31st, 2021, and we are resuming the Lane County Board of Commissioners meeting, which began yesterday, Tuesday, March 30, 2021. Before we move to the item on our agenda, I would like to note that there is some very timely business. I believe is that correct, Mr. Mokraheisky, that when we are through the work session, you would like to bring up with the board?
Yes, Chair. I think each of the commissioners received communication from the governor's office related to an attestation that's requested to move to Group 7. And we just wanted to get clarity from the board that you've actually delegated that authority to the administrator. We've communicated that to the governor's office, and our plan is to again communicate that because the communication with individual commissioners creates confusion, because then you all are sending me messages, which I appreciate, asking for that. So we just want to do some cleanup on that with the governor's office, but be clear with the board about that process as well, so we can handle that at the end of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. That brings us to item 1 in this morning's agenda, Public Works A. We have a work session now, and it relates to direction regarding building and land use permit fee waivers and staffing needs for the Holiday Farm Fire massive recovery effort. And we have several people here, notably Dan Hurley, Keir Miller, and Matt McRae. Dan, if you'd lead us in this.
Will do. Thank you, Chair Bernie, and good morning, Commissioners. So we're here to discuss this growing issue of really a bottleneck for processing permits, and a growing pressure to waive permit fees for building and land use applications. And you are all aware, of the scale of this disaster. This was unprecedented for the county. Close to 500 homes destroyed, and all of our hearts go out to the victims of this tragedy. And all of us want rebuilding to happen as soon as possible. And we've looked at other communities, particularly in California, after devastating wildfires, and it's taken years to rebuild. And there are so many barriers to rebuilding up in the McKenzie Valley, with the distance contractors need to go, the availability of contractors, the costs, the state land use hurdles that people have to cross. And we don't want to have our operations at land management of processing the permits to be a barrier to people. And we want to try to do what we can to ease the financial burden that people are facing that have lost so much. So Keira's put a lot of thought into this and has some proposals that you've seen in your memo. I would just like us to think about, I'm not so worried about the waiver part of things. This is revenue that we weren't expecting and hadn't budgeted for, with all these applications that will come flooding into us. I'm more concerned about being able to process those in a timely manner. So looking at the staffing needs. So wanting to authorize more positions, and I appreciate the board's previous action to authorize 3 positions. We do need more than that, and Keir will explain the need. But we need to figure out how we can fund those positions. And if it's not through fees, which is the typical way that we fund staff, then where do we look for that? So I'll leave that to you, and Keir will go into more depth on these issues. And thank you for your time in considering this morning.
Thanks, Dan. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Good morning, Chair Bernie and commissioners. Thanks for having us here. So yeah, as Dan mentioned, we're really here to talk about 2 kind of critical issues related to recovery efforts up in McKenzie. The first being the question about permit fee waivers, and the second being critical staffing needs. So yeah.
Forgive me, Keir, I'm sorry. Can all commissioners hear Keir all right? Because he's coming in fuzzy to me, but perhaps that's just me.
Sounds a bit like he has pudding in his mouth to me.
Keir, is there any way you can get a little better sound quality?
It's a little quiet for me too.
Does this sound better?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I'm on my phone right now. For some reason, my computer microphone is not working. I apologize. So, okay, great. So really those two issues being permit fee waivers and staffing. And just as a little bit of background, staff came before the board back in November, shortly after the fire, to discuss these two issues. And at that time, we presented some of the different things land management was doing to try to expedite permits, and we discussed the need for additional staffing, which Dan mentioned, and also brought up this concept of permit fee waivers. At that time, we had looked at what other jurisdictions, fire impacted counties in the state were doing in regards to permit fee waivers. We also took a hard look at our budget and tried to calculate, our needs, staffing needs, and as you all know, Land Management Division is a fee-supported organization. At that time, we didn't think we could continue to work through the volume of permits we were anticipating and have enough staff, have funding for staff if we were building permit fees. And at that time, Land Management recommendation was to not waive building permit fees and land use fees. It looked like at that point only one other Oregon county, Marion County, was waiving fees. However, we were waiving the fees for temporary emergency housing, RV permits, so folks could get into a place quickly, and we continue to do that. Since that time, there have been some changes. We've had a lot of interactions with the survivors of this fire. We have a better understanding of their needs. We also have a better understanding internally of our needs to be able to address the issues, of permitting quickly, providing really prompt and adequate service, and a special kind of service that these residents need. So we're coming back now, a few months later, with a better understanding of the needs and new proposals in regard to both these matters. So I'll talk first about the permit fee waivers. There is a proposal in your packet, and I kind of highlight some of the main issues to consider when thinking about permit waivers for residents. And I walk through a number of different questions for the board, and then sort of end with staff's recommendation based on some of the programs we see implemented in other counties and what we think would be the most benefit, the most bang for the buck, provide them really a focus on getting folks back into needed housing. That's sort of the priority with this proposal. So I talked through a number of different questions for the board to consider, related to who should qualify, how much funding should be made available, what sort of permit are appropriate to waive fees on should the board choose to do so. Talk about the issue of insurance, if folks are covered by insurance, about equity in terms of scaling waivers based on income, a number of different factors to consider. When we looked at all this and we calculated the sort of amount of fees we would have, as Dan mentioned, it's revenue that we would not have otherwise seen. It's sort of, it's not, and in my view, that's not really the most appropriate way to frame this discussion about what revenue would we not be getting in. More appropriate way is to think about, okay, we have this volume of permits that we're going to experience. What do we need in terms of staffing? What do we need to fund those staff to be able to process those permits in a timely manner so people can get back in their home? So in looking at these other jurisdictions, what we found is that most jurisdictions are offering very generous permit waiver programs. Not all impacted counties are doing this yet. Most, I think, all want to. There's just different funding realities in other jurisdictions. Obviously, they all want to be able to support their residents. So the programs that we see are primarily, kind of agnostic in the terms of who qualifies. It doesn't matter income level, insurance status or not. They're waiving permit fees across the board for residents who lost a home in the wildfire. They're also providing, as I mentioned, pretty generous fee waivers, but they take different approaches towards it. Some are waiving building and sanitation fees, others are waiving building and land use fees, some are waiving all fees. With the exception of a couple counties, Jackson County, which is actively pursuing grants to try to provide these waivers, and Clackamas County, which is basically doing what we're doing now, waiving fees on the temporary emergency housing. It seems like most jurisdictions are waiving fees on building or land use or sanitation. And this wasn't the case. This wasn't the information we found when we first presented this to the board. I think, like us, all these other counties are learning as they go and trying to respond to this and provide, needed assistance to their residents. So the recommendation that staff has provided, and obviously this can be amended, the board can pick and choose what sort of waivers you all feel are appropriate in this situation. But our thought is that probably a more robust program of waiving fees sort of across the board for building, land use, sanitation permit fees, essentially provide a complete package of fee waivers to try to incentivize redevelopment as quickly as possible and try to help these folks. And that would extend to, inspections, the needed land use, preliminary land use permits that are needed. Where we sort of have to draw the line somewhat, trying to be realistic and think about the amount of work that this will take and the cost involved, because the more work that is there that is unfunded, the more staff we will need to hire. We've sort of drawn the line around residential permit fee waivers, and at this point, we aren't recommending that the board waive fees for commercial structures, although I certainly understand that is something you may choose to do. There is some significance to that. Commercial structures upriver, they're sort of the economic base of the community, and there is value to that. Our priority here, of course, was to try to get folks back in needed housing. And then the other things that we did not really calculate in this analysis would be waivers for, complex land use permits, land divisions, things that aren't necessarily associated with the redevelopment of a property or the rebuilding of a lost structure. And then all of the ancillary structures, barns, outbuildings, garages, shops, double of those structures were lost in the fire. Over 1,000 of those structures were lost compared to 493 residences. So that is a whole other scale of work. Those permits in general, the costing out per square footage of those permits for accessory structures is less than the residences. We felt that kind of the biggest bang for the buck would be to waive fees for residences. But obviously, I'm sure there's a demand and there's interest in the community to have the county waive all permits for shops, barns, everything. So if that is something the board wants to do, we didn't completely pencil that out just because there's a lot of variables there. There's a lot of estimates based on how big a barn or a shop or accessory structure, and there's different cost calculations based on the use of the structure. But it's probably safe to assume it's close to double just because of the number of these structures, and some of them are quite large. So that was our recommendation as far as fee permit waivers go. Again, if we were to look at all of the waivers, the real critical thing to note is we calculated these costs based on a 50% recovery rate, and we actually think that's very optimistic. Looking, as Dan mentioned, at a lot of these other communities around the West, it's many, many years later, and they're only at a 25% rebuilding rate. So we think, obviously, the McKenzie Valley is special. People want to live there. There's a lot of demand to live there. We've seen just a tremendous amount of interest initially about rebuilding, and there's reasons for that we can talk about. But we have reason to believe that a lot of people really do want to return. So we're trying to project out at be optimistic and right-size the program to be able to meet that need for the future. So that's important to note. Those costs only reflect if 100% of residents return, which is unlikely in a 5-year period. The potential revenue loss would be greater. So that's key to consider. That's pretty simple overview of what we're suggesting. And again, our recommendation would be to formulate some sort of a waiver program if funding can be identified for the work that is needed to process these permits. And that leads me into the next part of the discussion, which is really about staffing and land management. When we met with the board in November, we were trying to estimate, what is a realistic number of additional staff we would need to be able to move these permits quickly through the system, because that's really our goal to provide just, these folks, a lot of them are owner builder. They don't have the funds necessarily to go out and get a contractor. And a lot of contractors are just frankly tied up right now. The construction market is really tight. It's hard for folks to get a contractor. So we want to be able to provide that, high level of service to really hold their hand, walk them through the process. Back in November, we sort of missed the mark on that. I think we weren't robust enough in our projections of what would be needed. And I think there's a number of reasons for that, honestly. You know, the reality is that redevelopment in Oregon is different. It's very different than in other places, and the process is extremely complex. And there's this issue, which I'm sure the board has heard about, this concern over a 1-year timeline window for redevelopment. Oregon land use laws have some really interesting rules regarding non-conforming uses. And a lot of folks are concerned that if they don't start reconstruction within a 1-year timeline, they may be more difficult for them to rebuild. So we're getting a huge rush of permit activity early on in the process. We're getting a huge rush of questions. The other really complicating factor is, you know, a customer service model during COVID-19. Our lobby is closed. We're going to do all this customer service over the phone. We have opened a remote satellite office up in Newburgh, but we can't really meet the demand for the types of inquiries. They come in over the phone. Folks drop off submittal packages in our vestibule, and without the benefit of having, you know, opportunity to meet with them over the counter 2 or 3 times leading up to the submittal. So the submittal packages we're getting, some are complete. The vast majority are not complete, and they require a lot of hand-holding through the process to get them in a position where we can even begin to process the building permit. So that's very labor-intensive. We do need additional staff. And then just in general, despite the greater economic downturn, our projections about, you know, permitting activity and land management were off. We didn't see a decline in permit activity like we thought, and we've seen a huge increase, a double increase in inquiries about development, not just in the Holiday Farm Fire area, but town-wide. There's pent-up interest, I think, for development, and this is consistent with what we're seeing in other counties across the state. For example, one of our, you know, close comparators, Deschutes County, they're in the process of hiring 8 additional staff in their building and planning programs. They're not suffering from a wildfire. They're not recovering from a wildfire. They're just trying to staff up in response to the growing demand for staff. So we really are sort of at a critical point where I think additional staff are needed to provide the sort of service that customers in the Mackenzie Valley deserve, and frankly, to be able to focus, have a team that is focused on these individuals, and then we can not, you know, have impacts to other residents outside of the Mackenzie Valley who are also trying to go through the development process. So our proposal at this point is that we are requesting the board approve the creation of 6 additional positions within land management. One of these positions has already been funded. Austin Ramirez has done a great job finding funding for a position we're calling a permit navigator. And this will be a critical position, sort of like an ombudsman or really one-on-one customer service professional who can work with residents upriver and provide the kind of hand-holding that they need and guide them through the process. The other positions are frontline staff that would be processing permits, doing the inspections, assisting folks over the phone. That's the bulk of the workforce that we're looking to add at this point. So obviously, land management has tapped into its reserves already to fund the 3 positions we've already created. If we want to bring on these additional staff, we'll have to get further into our reserves, which I don't recommend we do. We've spent a long time trying to create sustainable reserves so we can weather these sort of challenging times. And if we draw our reserves down too much, the issue is that this workforce is very difficult to train. It takes upwards of a year to train planners. And if we drain down our reserves, we're in a position where we have to lay off a lot of staff. And then the economy picks back up, we're really behind the 8 ball. We have to go out, find funding, hire, train staff. It's better to keep, staff on board, maintain that experienced workforce, and not be trying to play catch up the next time, when the economy, there's a big boost in the economy. So at this point, we recognize there's a strong need for additional positions. We don't think it's prudent to tap further into reserves, and I think there's some discussion that occur around that as well. So I'll leave it there unless there are, I'm sure there's questions, and I'm happy to answer them. Thanks.
It sounds to me like there are questions, and I see Commissioner Farr's hand up.
I just have two quick clarifications, Chair. First, the recommendation is section E. I think the sections are mislabeled for anybody looking online. We have two section E's. So I think the recommendation maybe should be section F. That seems pretty evident. The second is, do we have a number, both the dollar amount and the percentage of annual operations that we have in reserve? So the first is just...
we do. Sorry, yeah, to clarify, you're correct that this should be section F is the analysis section. And then we do have a number in reserves. Right now, I don't have the exact figure, but it's enough to fund land management operations for approximately just under a year at this point, close to, I'm going to say about 6.5 million.
Thank you, Chair. That's a good number. Thank you, Chair. That's my initial questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Buck.
Thank you, Chair. When it comes to revenue sources, I've been working with Mr. Kyler on a joint letter through AOC for fire affected communities for those wildfire victims across the state. We all have the same problem, right? We all have the same issue with trying to fund permits for folks. We have the same issue of trying to increase staffing and land management. So we have put together a letter for the Oregon Wildfire Council expressing this need across the state. Chair Burney and myself signed off on that letter along with some other counties that have the same issue. We are hoping for some revenue generation from that Wildfire Council through the legislature. We don't know where that is at the moment. I'm sure it's been conveyed and being considered, but I just wanted to make sure that everybody was aware of that ask as well.
Thank you, Commissioner. Are there other commissioners that would like to make a comment, ask a question at this time? Commissioner Bozievich.
So I have several questions about this, but just want to express my support for moving ahead with some fashion of permit fee waivers on this. And I appreciate the effort. I'd like to go as far as we can in waiving as many fees as possible for the fire victims. Quick question is it thought that this program is going to be retroactive? Because I know a lot of people that are already well into the permit process. And I just want to make sure that one, it's going to be retroactive, and then two, will there be any transferability of it? Quite a few people had property up for sale at the time of the fire, or they're elderly and just can't deal with the rebuild process. And part of the value of their property is how difficult it will be to rebuild or not, and how costly. So that those two questions, retroactivity and transferability of the fee waivers.
Sure, Commissioner Bozievich, we did look at those two factors, and as part of the proposal, we are suggesting that the board make this program retroactive because we have seen a large number of permits come through the door already. We did not make a recommendation in terms of the transferability. I understand that at least one other county is making the waivers available just to the owners, the original owners, and not when they change hands. That's a policy choice for the board. We didn't make a recommendation regarding that.
Yeah, it's something for us to think about a little bit. I'm aware of at least one couple in their 80s that's choosing not to rebuild because of their age and timing, yet their wealth is tied up in the property that got burnt. So that being able to sell that and have value in selling that is important to that. So that answers those two questions real quick. I did not see listed as available for permit fee waivers, legal lot verification or forest dwelling replacement verification. You know, those two processes can be very expensive and time consuming and seem to be wrapped up in a lot of these properties. Is that going to be part of the proposal?
So there are forest dwellings, you know, we only had a small percentage of properties are in the forest zone that are impacted. I think around 20, but not an insignificant number at all. We did not initially put that as part of the proposal. In legal lot verification, some of those can be handled as a relatively straightforward type 1 land use process, and those we are recommending, but then others can get extremely complex, can get costly, you know, for residents and also for staff. They're often appealed, you know, it can be a huge strain on, you know, it will add significantly to cost. So we did not recommend that at this time.
Yeah, but some of my concern about that is those folks did have a house they were occupying prior to the fire, and it's, you know, the fact that their legal lot verification is going to be complex wasn't something that they counted on, you know, in having their, you know, suffering from this disaster. So whatever we can do to try and help with some of that also, but I understand that it is costly. And then one of the things we're going to have to look for is where do we reach for some of these costs? I have some other ideas around looking at some other reserve funds outside of LMD. I do want to remind the rest of the board, and Kira, you're aware of this. You brought forward some financial planning. Was that 2 or 3 years ago? I can't even remember now, around LMD and reserves. And the reason why we hold almost a year's worth of reserves for that division is the up and down nature of permit applications and the need to maintain a staffing level that deals with the surges in permits through the lulls in permits. And that's one of the reasons why we carry a larger than normal reserve in that department. So rating that reserve may not be the best idea. And it might be a good idea if you, I don't know if you remember that presentation, Kier, or if you were even in, you know,
I do.
at the time. But it might be a good idea to resend that at least the board packet back around to the rest of the board, particularly Commissioner Trieger, who I know wasn't here at that time. I can't remember if that was before or after Commissioner Buck and Chair Burney were on the board, just so they understand the nature of the flow of work through land management and the financial situation there. I hope we can do, something for the folks there. Our permit fees, because we are an enterprise fund, we're already higher than every other county around. Almost all the other counties subsidize their permit departments and use general fund monies to lower their permit fees in the first place, so they don't have to reach as far to reduce them. But they are in the position where they didn't lose such a significant portion of their general fund as we lost it with the end of the Secure Rural Schools Act and the lack of timber dollars, where we had to put our permit department basically on a cost basis, where they have to charge enough to recoup all costs. That said, I'm hoping that maybe as we start finding out more about the American Recovery Act and some of the other funds that are coming, crisis funds that are coming from the federal government, how flexible those one-time funds are going to be. And this is a great, I think, use of one-time funding that has economic development tied to it, because there's lots of jobs that will be generated from these permits, that we may be able to make a tie together and utilize some of that federal dollars to subsidize this. But whatever we can do to reduce the cost for those folks rebuilding from the fire and going to the max extent possible, I'm in support of that.
Thank you, Commissioner. Is there any other comment, question? Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you, Chair Bernie. I want to make sure I'm wrapping my head around this since this is new for me, but my understanding is we have a need for increased staffing capacity in our lands management and permitting, and this only increases that need. And it's really less about do we need to add this staffing to meet the need upriver, but it's how are we going to pay for it, because otherwise we're just also further getting behind in the already existing workload before this disaster happened. Is that correct? Thank you.
Say that's accurate, yeah.
In that case, for the moment, that's all when we, assuming, because I also just want to echo commissioners who've spoken before me, my support for doing all we can to help with the rebuild. I do have some thoughts and concerns about how we do that in an equitable fashion, particularly as regards primary residence versus second or vacation homes, and also the economic equity in terms of not just straight up income, but rent or mortgage burden versus income for folks up there, so that we think about how we're sequencing rather than, or if we're doing a first come, first serve for folks who are applying for these waivers.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Buck.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to add a sense of urgency to our conversation, specifically because we are hearing from wildfire victims that they are at a point where not only are they waiting for this 12-month timeline issue, which is a sense of purgatory as to whether they start trying to rebuild now, trying to get a permit through a cumbersome process, or if they just sell and move out and let somebody else down the line work on this issue to rebuild. Because right now we are seeing people put their places up for sale. And I want to see people come back into that community as soon as humanly possible. There are issues with trying to figure out how to fund this, but we need to figure out that as we're building the airplane and trying to get it moving off the ground. We can't wait to determine whether we want to do reductions in permits, fees, and add staff until we know how to backfill some funds. I really want to see us use some of our reserves or some other funding mechanisms. We've had plenty of conversations at the staff level about either American Rescue money, reserves, some other means, which is why we put that letter together to the Oregon Wildfire Council. But if we don't do something now, people are moving out. And they're already crushed. They're already still dealing with trauma. This is just a nail in the coffin for them being able to come back to their community and come back to some sense of normalcy and rebuilding. I just want to be sure that we know that this is such a powerful issue for the people on the ground right now. It will really make a difference on whether that community rebuilds. I think as a board, it will be one of the defining moments as to how we serve these people in a long-term recovery fashion. Thank you, Chair.
Any other questions or comments? Commissioner Bozievich.
I just want to say thank you to Commissioner Buck for expressing that, because I couldn't agree more. We need to move ahead with this quickly and be public very soon about our ability to make waivers and temporary use of LMD's reserves, with the understanding, I hope, of the rest of the board of why rating those might not be the best thing to do. And I do also agree with the need to hire additional staff. there's plenty of people outside of the fire footprint that I hear from on a almost daily basis about permit delays and the length of time it takes to get a permit. And part of that's the COVID issues. You know, it's very difficult to, as Keir described, not just for fire victims, but for just the average person trying to build out in the county to submit a clean package the first time for a permit, and having to drop it off in a vestibule and then wait several weeks to hear back by email that you missed something is a very frustrating process for the public. So additional staff to try and to expedite some of those processes, I think, is just a great thing, not just for the fire victims, but for the entire county. So yeah, I'd be good with that. You know, and I did send a note to Jeff Orlandini and copied Dan and Steve earlier about the possibility of utilizing solid waste reserves to fund this, because there may be a tie in the fact that there's a significant amount of debris brought to Short Mountain as part of this crisis and the cleanup. And whether or not we were getting reimbursed for that debris, I don't know, and whether that's building up any reserve that could be tied and brought in for this. But there may be some way of connecting those. Although I really would, you know, our county administrator and our finance folks and our legal staff probably have a much better handle on being able to tie where we can pull funding from and make a connection and legally be able to use it. But I do agree with Commissioner Buck. We need to have something announced relatively soon on how we're, you know, that we're going to waive permit fees, and we're moving forward quickly with that, because I do think that's important for the people out there. I'm hearing a lot, you know, everything from, you know, Keir, from Forest. I do know a couple people that did suffer a loss that are in the forest, and they're being asked to pay a $500 fee to verify they can replace a dwelling in the exact same footprint they lost it. You know, and that's just that one little application. So that sort of frustration of, I just want to rebuild right where I was, but I've got to pay $500 to be told it's okay for me to do that. It is not a good thing. So that's sort of where the sooner we can take away that trauma, the better. And I completely agree with Commissioner Buck on that.
I believe Commissioner Vozovich agrees with you, Commissioner Buck. Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair Bernie. And I'd like to state that Commissioner Buck spoke very eloquently for me as well in what you just said. Word for word, Commissioner Buck, well stated and well elaborated upon Commissioner Vozovich. I think the three of us are in agreement. Let's do something as quickly as possible to give people the Heather, you called it the getting them out of a sense of purgatory. You know, people are just hanging in with not knowing what the future holds is one of the most difficult things for people to deal with. And when there's financial difficulty involved as well, then that begins to slip into the behavioral health area also. It affects people's psyche completely, and we have other issues to deal with down the road. So, Chair Bernie, you have three people that said the same thing out of Commissioner Buck's mouth, by the way. Beyond that, looking at the funding, you know, we have a healthy reserve in public works, and as needed, you know, to weather whatever ups and downs in the economy may arise. And as we look at how to fund this, I guess my question for you, Dan, and Mr. Mokrahajski, if you're hearing me, is for the first year, what would be would it be possible to partially spend down reserves from public works a little bit and then distribute the load across the rest of the county funds to fill the balance for the first year, and then work on a more permanent budgetary condition for the following years? That's just a question. And, you know, we're close to a 1 year operating budget in reserve. We'd like to be at that. We'd like to stay at that. But, you know, would it be easier for us to recover that to its 1-year status, current status, than it would some of the other funds that may be drawn down in order to subsidize. Just a question and something to consider as we move forward. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, I just like, before Mr. Mokrahajski answers that, I would like to point out that up until this point, we've been talking about the sentiment of the board regarding policy and decisions, and now the question relates to the how-to. And I think, Mr. Mokrahajski, please, I know you're ready to respond.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, and this is a great conversation, so I don't want to cut off the conversation. And to your point exactly, Mr. Chair, what we really want to hear from the board is the what, and then we can figure out the how-to. So I use this analogy, and I'll use it here again, of the bus, that in this instance, Dan and Keir and I are the bus drivers, and the 5 of you are the passengers, right? We're just driving the bus. You have to tell us where you want to go. We don't know what the destination is. So you have to set that expectation about what do you want to see at the end of this? To what extent do you want fees to be subsidized? How smooth and quick do you want the process to be? You need to set that expectation and ultimately define the destination that you want to get to, and then we can figure out the how-to, and we'll bring back to you the how-to. How do we pay for this? And I think there are a number of options that you've sort of many of you have alluded to, and I appreciate the fact is when I've had separate conversations with some commissioners, they've said, well, I don't want to propose an idea if we don't have the ability to pay for it. I very much appreciate that fiscal stewardship and responsibility. In this case, I think that I do hope and believe that there's a potential that some of the American Rescue Plan funds could be used. I think we view this as a one-time investment over a few years. The positions that we would add would likely be needed for a couple-year period of time, but they would be limited duration to focus on getting these 400 plus residences that have been destroyed through this process. But then after that really intensive glut of work, we're not going to need all of that. So that's different than adding staff indefinitely into the future. So I would qualify that as a one-time expense. We also think, as has been alluded to, we know I think Commissioner Buck indicated this, there's some potential funding at the state, and we're trying to be proactive about going after that. I think at the staff level, we completely agree with the sentiments which is why we're having the work session today. This isn't a time to wait. These residents need some certainty and understanding about this. So what we want to hear from the board is really give us clarity on your expectation and your destination around fees, where you want to end up with fees, what type of impact, if any, around waiving of fees, and then what you want that process to look like. You tell us that, we can develop the plan, we'll bring the plan back to you, and we'll tell you what the options are, and then you get to approve that plan. So I just wanted to kind of clarify those roles and responsibilities so you don't feel that right now in this moment, you have to figure out where are we going to pull these resources from. We can pull that plan together and give you options.
Thank you for providing all the backup to my point, which is the division between policy and operations, correct? I see Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Mokrahajski, for that clarification. Completely agree. I always say if we start our conversations with money, we end our conversations. I want to echo the sense of urgency and to connect it to what I was speaking to earlier. My primary concern here is that we not create a situation, particularly as people are opting to sell, where other folks can come in and develop essentially a corridor of vacation homes. This is a community. People want to get back home. People have neighbors and relationships, and we want to do everything we can to help people maintain and foster their sense of neighborhood and community, and ensure that we don't create an advantage to folks with more resource than we are creating for folks for whom this is their home, their primary residence, their community, and where their lives are. So that was my main overarching sort of philosophical concern, and I couldn't agree more that the sense of urgency goes hand in hand with that goal. Thank you.
Yes, Keir, did you want to respond to that?
Sure. I just had a couple of thoughts about some of the comments I've heard from the commissioners. If I could just respond, I think we're trying to work out some of the details here. So Commissioner Bozievich had mentioned his interest in seeing potential waivers for the legal lot applications and the special use permit applications. And I'll just say that I fully understand that need, and I certainly think that would be well received. I will point out that if that is the direction the board wants to go to, that's a pretty specialized position that works on that sort of research. And right now we have one individual who does that work, and they're completely buried in legal lot applications, as Commissioner Bozovich knows. So if that is direction that the board wants to go in, I think staff would want to revise our proposal for when this comes back up to revisit it. Probably looking at adding at least a half FTE or a full FTE in that regards, just as a heads up. And then the other piece around Commissioner Trieger's comments, which I really appreciate, I think there are ways we could design this program that could, prioritize residents whose primary dwelling was there. Like we could prioritize the processing of those permits in terms of, our typical way for equity is first come, first serve. First application in the door is the first one out. If there are residents who are wanting to rebuild a vacation home, for example, it's not their primary residence, there are ways we could structure it to focus on those individuals first. So I appreciate those comments as well.
Okay, well, we're still in discussion. Commissioner Farr, you had your hand up. I believe this might be the third contribution. So I think after you, if I might speak, I would like to.
Sure. My first clarification, but absolutely, Chair Bernie, but you can go ahead of me if you'd like. I just wanted to say, I understand the division between policy and funding, and the two blend from time to time. In this situation, I'm fully in favor of moving forward with establishing the policy, and I do know that the staff is fully capable of making a recommendation regarding how things are funded. Mine is simply a suggestion regarding the reserve funds from the Public Works. So I want to thank you for that. And Chair, that's all.
Oh, no, I thank you, Commissioner. I'm glad you brought that up because the point is there are ways to do it. And I think that was the point you were making. Here's what I would like to contribute to the discussion. And I'm speaking not just as a commissioner, but as someone who in 1989 lost the use of my home to an earthquake and went through this process as a user. Even dwellings not in the fire area are being affected by this. This is backlogging everything. What I saw in the material before us, and correct me if I'm wrong, was not a specific, it was a discussion of how this might be funded in addition to identifying what you saw as the need. I personally believe that every member of this board, and if I'm wrong, I will learn it really quick, is absolutely supportive of whatever is necessary for people to rebuild in a fast and fair process and get their lives back together. Personally, I think we should approve both the fee, the waivers, just me speaking for myself, and the increase in staff now, without knowing how we're going to pay for it. I think the sooner we establish a policy to that effect, the sooner that frees up our administrator and staff to figure out how to do that, even if that, even no matter what that requires. And it also enables our staff to go and aggressively seek resource, even if initially we do have to dip into reserve. I think we need to get going. I have a dumb question to ask, and forgive me for it, and it relates to something that I wrote down here. Oh, do we have a grandfather's clause so that no matter whether a structure met requirements or didn't meet requirements, but whatever it was, that a person can rebuild?
There is case law around that question, Commissioner Berney, and we'd love to provide a definitive yes or no answer. We do know that if individuals begin reconstruction within 1 year, they there's the grandfathering or they become vested. But the question is, how much work do they have to do within that first year? Is it just apply for a building permit, or is it to, apply for a building permit and perfect that authorization by, expending X amount of dollars on the construction of the house? Because obviously getting a permit and then building a house can take several months. So the question in case law, which is not clear yet and which is frustrating, is at what level is an individual vested and they qualify their grandfather? So it's not black and white, and this is exactly the kind of question that's frustrating so many folks upriver. So it's a great question. It's not a dumb question.
Well, thank you. It should be black and white. There shouldn't be all these nuances. People should be able to rebuild whatever they lost, period. Those are my comments. At this point in time, unless there's further discussion, I'd love to entertain some discussions of direction. You know how I feel. Commissioner Buck.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to add one sidebar that I didn't necessarily see in the materials. And that is that the benefit of having the lowered permit fees, I want to see for Lane County residents or the original owners of the home. I didn't necessarily see a sidebar for folks that may be coming in from out of state and buying property because it is selling now. And I don't think our goal is to necessarily subsidize somebody who's coming in to the community that way. We really want to be able to help those that are from the community rebuild in that community, or the original owners. I do know that some are vacation homes and second dwellings from people from out of state. And if they owned that at the time of the fire, I want them to have that benefit, but not folks that are coming in from other areas and trying to reap the benefit of a low fee structure in order to rebuild something new. So if there's some kind of language that could be included that way, I would really appreciate that. And I think the residents of that community would really appreciate that as well. There is some other areas who have implemented these fees, and they also have quite a few folks that they have second homes. For example, in the San Diego, there were people that had second homes as well. They originally, in some counties, they originally had just said, okay, permit fee reductions were only for those that were permanent residents in that location. They got a lot of pushback from those people that had those second homes, and eventually opened it up to those two. I am okay with that for our area as well, because that brings some economic development and tourism to the community, and they owned it at the time of the fire. I believe that they should also have that benefit. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I think Keir wants to respond as we see his face on our screen and hear him via his phone.
I apologize. Not a response, but I did want to clarify one question in regards to the waivers. We know that some individuals are choosing to leave, but they are maybe elderly and they want to sell the property to their kids, somebody in the family, and that's kind of a distinction that I'd like some clarification on. If we do decide to go that route, is it only for true, kind of out of area folks coming in to buy up these properties that, that are at a lower, permit rate, or is it, does it extend to the families of these victims as well? I guess.
So I find, forgive me, but it seemed to me the comments of Commissioner Trieger and then Commissioner Buck relate to equity, relate to residents that lost their homes first, and then opening it up with that kind of sensitivity and understanding. If I'm wrong, please, commissioners, tell me. So it would seem to me that with that direction, you could bring back to us a plan that in fact does that, and we can provide input to that.
I'm happy to do that. Yeah, I just that one question.
Trieger and Buck. Okay, thank you. Commissioner Bozovich.
Thank you, Chair. I actually think there was a little bit of disparity between Commissioner Trieger and Commissioner Buck's comments. Commissioner Buck specifically said that she did not have a problem with second homes being eligible for the fee waivers. I agree with that. One, I think we will have set up a extreme difficulty for Kira's department to determine what's a primary residence and what's a second home. You know, so they become a judge, and then that becomes something that gets appealed and becomes a bureaucratic nightmare for the department. Two, those second homes add taxable value to all the special districts up there. One of the things that, you know, the Rainbow Fire District's going to have to deal with is a sudden loss of taxable value. And the sooner some of those, quote, vacation homes get rebuilt, the faster their taxable tax base gets rebuilt, and they're back on a good financial setting. Not to mention all of the small businesses up and down that valley, you know, and you know, I just spoke with the Mackenzie Business Association. I know both you and Commissioner Buck have spoken to that association, Chair. They depend on that tourism economy that depends on having rentals up the valley. So I think making that distinction is really troublesome to me, and that you're putting a whole nother burden on a department that's overburdened with permits to start making determinations around who's eligible and equity and issues like that. I think if we stick with the primary residence on a property, I can kind of agree with secondary structures not being eligible, but no one's going to rebuild a garage if they can't rebuild their house. No one's going to rebuild a barn if they can't rebuild their house, whether it's a vacation rental or a primary residence. Yeah, those secondary structures will never get rebuilt if the primary structure, you know, is being held up over permit fees, et cetera. So I fully support the idea of you know, let's limit it to the residential structures for now, because that makes sense. And let's not try and distinguish whether or not it's a primary or secondary residence. Let's not try and distinguish income levels and everything else that was mentioned around trying to do equity, because I think you're going to throw a huge burden on our land management department they've never had. You know, and let's just try and move forward with some clear direction around, you know, waiving permit fees in this area, because I think that's really important. We've gotten into that transferability issue. You know, I mentioned that was one of my first questions was about retroactivity and transferability. And Keir mentioned, you know, elderly folks wanting to sell to children. I'm aware of somebody that grew up in the Mackenzie Valley that wants to move back there, that had been in the Midwest for a while, and is looking at purchasing a piece of property from a fire victim in the Nimrod area, and is interested in whether or not they're going to be able to, whether they're going to have any sort of reconstruction fees waived or not as part of their decision factor, whether they carry out that transaction. Now, that's not a person that they're currently a Lane County resident, but, you know, is that a transferability issue? You know, so I think that needs to be fleshed out quite a bit, that question of, are we going to allow transfer of this fee waiver right to the next owner? I think beyond one transfer, you know, is probably where we want to at least draw the line. We shouldn't have somebody sell a property and then the person flip it and be allowed to maintain that right for fee waivers, you know. But, you know, from a parent to a family member, or, you know, a niece or nephew, to somebody that's trying to return to the area and looking to try and find a way to make it work for them. Some of those sound like a reasonable, you know, one-time transfer of that right. But beyond that, I wouldn't recommend us allowing it to be transferred more than once.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Trieger, did you still want to speak?
I did. Thank you, Chair. I want to clarify. I am not opposed to waivers for all structures that were destroyed. I was referencing a prioritization process, and I stand by that. The point of this is also there's an overarching point of supporting as fast a rebuild as possible, and that is a community rebuild. And primary residences are what make a community. And I am absolutely willing to hear from Commissioner Buck if I'm off base about this, but my understanding is that the primary goal and the folks that are suffering the most are those who are unhoused now as a result of their residence being burned, of folks who are missing out on the benefits of social connectivity because their community, their neighborhood burned. I'm not opposed to, and I completely agree, it is the right and responsible thing to do to rebuild everything back as quickly as we can for the reasons Commissioner Bozovich mentioned financially, but that the priority and the primary goal should be to help community members get back to their homes and rebuild those homes. I think it's, if we don't prioritize equitable process in everything we do, we will never achieve equity. And this board has stated and embraced and adopted resolutions and both policies and made verbal commitments to equity as a goal. And the longer we defer it, the longer it will take for us to achieve equitable outcomes for everyone in Lane County. So I stand by my comments, and I want to clarify that I'm not opposed to fee waivers for second homes.
Thank you, Commissioner. I don't see Commissioner Butt wanting to correct you. Commissioner Buck? No? Okay. I don't see this as a disagreement. I see this as a policy, and when one sequences who gets that attention first, those equity concerns simply help drive that formula. That's all. We're going to have a limited amount of resources, and we have a tremendous demand out there. I would also like to share with this group that a very good friend of mine who does drawings for rebuilds or additions or what have you, who has over a dozen clients that are right now ready to build, and this process has them absolutely stuck and they can't. His comment to me was that waiving permits is good and it's nice and it's helpful, but it's the time it takes to get those permits that is really holding people back. And Kier, my understanding is that's what you're trying to address here. That's why we're looking at a number of staff people with a number of skills. And I saw that Dan Hurley wants to contribute. Dan?
Thank you, the entire board, for expressing your sentiments around urgency and equity. I think you've given us enough direction to get moving so that we can bring some proposals back to you, and we'll do that as quickly as possible. We'll bring you a proposal and a draft board order for staffing. And I want to let you know that we know that the staffing, there's a lag time in that hiring, and we wanted to get that going as quickly as possible. So we requested authorization from the county administrator's office and received that today to start the recruitments on these positions, knowing that they wouldn't be given an offer until authorized by the board. So we will start those recruitments, and we will be bringing back the authorization request to you as soon as possible. So that's for the staffing piece. The fire recovery was identified as a pilot project for our equity lens. And so we will be reviewing this proposal through that equity lens. I want to try to run through that as quickly as we can to bring something back to you that takes a look at that lens that you've seen and the list of questions that we should look at. So hopefully that will help guide these choices around equity. And we will then follow up with a work session around funding. I do think there are adequate reserves at land management to get going with some initial funding for staffing and absorbing these fee waivers with the intention that we would try to find alternate funding through other sources. Thank you.
Dan, I know that you feel you have all you need to move forward, but I don't think we're quite through yet. Commissioner Farr?
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to point out something that you said regarding time. That is always the issue surrounding permitting. People are typically fine paying fees as long as they get timely processing of the fees. And Dan, you covered that. You are addressing that with the recommended position additions, and we're all in favor of that. My question for you, Dan, is our human resource department has a number of recruitments in process. You're adding another recruitment in process. And I guess it's important that it get placed in the sequencing inside of our human resources department, which is not my business. But my recommendation is that we get on it as quickly as possible, because you cannot do anything until these positions are filled. And we find ourselves quite often in positions where we're not able to fill through the recruiting process as quickly as we'd like to. So I know, Dan, you sense the urgency in this, and you're hearing it from the entire board. So thank you. And you have my input. I think I'm waiting to see what the ultimate plan is, and I have a great deal of trust in you and your department. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair.
Do any other commissioners want to weigh in at this point? I know Kier, but do any other commissioners want to weigh in at this point? Actually, we're just trying to test Kier's patience. Yes, Kier, go ahead. We can't hear you.
Really sorry about that. I want to say a comment in response to Commissioner Farr. In really as a word of caution, it's been recommended that I make this point abundantly clear to the board that even if we take all these steps, if we waive fees, if we increase staff to try to expedite these permits, which we will do, there will still be applicants who are facing this challenging land use process that is cumbersome and is problematic, and it will take time. And as Commissioner Farr mentioned, the hiring process takes a long time, and it can take a long time to get folks trained and up to speed. That being said, we're going to do everything we can with haste to expedite permits, but I want to just provide some realism that it will take time, and not everybody will be happy with the permitting process. And much of that has to do with the Oregon statewide planning process, the building codes that Lane County, that you as commissioners don't have a lot of ability to change. So just want to make that clear.
And if you don't mind, Commissioner Bozovich, just a quick response. And on behalf of the board, and unless someone disagrees, I think we want to be very clear that we want this to occur as fast as it can occur, that people are already dissatisfied, and we are all hearing about some of the challenges and issues and frustrations and anxieties when lives are turned upside down. So that's going to be a dynamic tension, and I think you're going to find many of the members of this body saying to you and Dan, yes, we're giving you that room. When are you going to get back to us with a plan? When are we going to be able to approve these things? When are we, blah, blah, blah. So that's where we're at, I think. But I know that Commissioner Bozovich had his hand up.
Two things I want to say. I appreciate Kier's comments, because you asked a question, Chair Burney, about grandfathering. There is no such thing in Oregon.
Really? I'm sorry.
Yeah. You can have had a house on your piece of property for 75 years. If it burns down, you have no guaranteed right you're allowed to rebuild it in this state. If you're outside of city limits, that's just basically the way our land use laws work. You have to prove you have a lot that was legal to build on in the first place. That's the legal lot verification. If it's in a forest zone, there's all sorts of other determinations about whether you have a right to build there. If it's in farm ground, there's also determinations. There's no absolute right to grandfathering. That's what Kier was pointing out earlier, was you don't have that. One of the other things that we haven't discussed at all here is there are some policy decisions that maybe we needed to talk about at the board level, because they're being made at staff level, around interpretation of building code and state law that might make it easier for people to reconstruct. And the one thing I'll point out, and it's become a source for many people up there, is the requirement to get a geotechnical report based on Doug Amy's new hazard maps. And there is a policy decision being made at the staff level about which soil types on that mapping and which levels of risk determine the need for a soils report. Now, mind you, with all those people trying to rebuild, geotechnical folks are overbooked and overpriced. So it's a $2,000 minimum report, sometimes up to $5,000 to get a geotechnical report. And we're requiring them for moderate risk of liquefaction rather than high or extreme, and that's one of the places where if we maybe change which risk level, and I don't think we need to have that discussion today, but I would recommend that maybe there's some places that staff could look at and come back to the board for a board decision, and maybe with risk management talking to us about providing some direction that might ease the burden on people's ability to reconstruct. And that's one of the very easy places we could do it, is in choosing where we draw that line to require soils report.
We can certainly come back for discussion, Commissioner.
Yeah, although I can't make that direction directly, so I'm kind of sort of stealing a moment here to do an agenda team request and look for at least 2 other head nods on that.
I'm sorry, I was muted, Commissioner Buck.
I know the geotech issue has kind of baffled people because it's newer. And of course, these people haven't had to rebuild in quite some time. I'm not really involved in what the staff says directly about what they do or how they do or do not require the geotech report. I think it's worth having a staff conversation about that. And then maybe reporting back to the board as to what that issue truly encompasses.
Thank you. Commissioner Trieger.
Thank you, Chair. This is not entirely specifically directed to this, but it just brings to mind, I just wanted to mention it for anybody who might be watching this later. I had the opportunity, and thank you, Keir, for some of your time the other day just to help me wrap my head more broadly around land management and your work here at the county as part of my onboarding. And in our conversation and talking about how the general public perceives some of the decisions and some of the operational aspects of the work being done at the county, it reminds me a lot of what happened with, has happened and continues to, but is quieting down some with our vaccine rollout, which is that this is new territory for us, that we have really skilled, committed staff who operate with a lot of integrity, who have the right training and the technical skills and the background to do this sort of day-to-day regular work, but now we're being asked to level up in a way that none of us have ever had to before or anticipated we would have to, and are operating within a broader statewide and then federal system of regulations and guidelines and resources and so on. And the general public's experience of that as we're dealing with that intersection is something to take into account. So I guess what I just want to say is we've been here before. We're in the midst of it with vaccine rollout. We're seeing the longer we do that work, the better we get at it, and the more responsive we are, and the more successes we have, the more the general perception of the public of our efforts shifts to the positive. And so I just want to offer that this is such a challenging time, and also just appreciate the extra hours and time and stress and strain put on this entire organization, but particularly the frontline staff who are trying their hardest to respond to people who are truly in crisis right now with the best that they have to work with.
Dan, earlier you said you had what you needed. Do you still feel you have what you need?
I think we have enough to get going. We'll certainly have another robust discussion when we bring the proposal back for the waiver.
And is it impossible at this time to give us any kind of an ETA of when you might be able to do that?
I'll look to Keir on that.
Considering the direction, we'll put this together probably in the week. And the whole issue is the turnaround time with the board office. So if Mr. Mokrahysky is okay with us or if Ms. Jones is okay with us providing this with less lead time than normal, we can schedule this just as soon as possible within the next week. I think we have the framework of the proposal. We have some direction on the board, and we can come back with a work session to hammer out the details.
Unless Mr. Mokrahysky wants to weigh in, as he is wont to do when we see him on the screen pop in, I think we're prepared to end this work session. Oh, that's what he wanted to do. Okay. Yes, anyone that wants to, please do, Commissioner Farr, but I think staff does have what they need, so we are moving forward now.
And just for clarification, it seems like it's option 1, both on fee waivers and on staff additions. So
I believe that is correct, sir. Yes.
And I'll just add, Chair, so we will need to do a Wednesday work session, as Keir indicated, and we certainly heard from the board, and we appreciate this is of a timely nature, and so we want to bring this back as soon as possible. My hope would be, I guess I'd say my expectation would be we'd have it as a work session next Wednesday, with the ability for the board to make a decision to provide, if there's action that needs to happen there. So I'll work with Dan and Keir to get that in front of the board as soon as possible, but really appreciate the thoughtful conversation and deliberation by the board.
I would like to echo that. I think in this conversation, every commissioner has contributed substantially from a fundamentally different perspective, and it's only creating, strong momentum moving forward. So Dan, Keir, Steve, commissioners, thank you very much. We are done this work session, but we are not done this meeting, because if you recall, Mr. Mokrahysky had an item he wanted to review with the board that was timely before we adjourn.
So Chair, as I just walk through this issue, I'm going to point you to, yes, thank you to Keir and Dan for your time and all the work that they did. They, really scrambled to bring all that information. Keir and his team are doing great work with limited resources, so appreciate that. So if you look under emergency business, you should see, and you should have an email from Ms. Jones. We posted an updated order, and we've done this, consulted with County Council, and out of an abundance of caution, what we're proposing is that the board take action on updating this order. It's basically the previous emergency declaration for COVID-19 that you've renewed several times, that allows for various authorities to the county administrator to spend up to $5 million to respond to the emergency. It refers to other emergency procedures that the board has put in place previously. We felt that it was appropriate just to add some clarity to this, to be clear. And so there was, you'll see under the now therefore, do you all see that? Thumbs up, you see the email and
I am not seeing it, but let me.
Oh, I just want to make sure as I'm talking through it that you actually have it.
Yeah, I don't. Did that come directly from Diana this morning? Is that what I'm looking for? I'm sorry.
She may not have had a chance to send it yet. Diane, are you there?
If you're reviewing the agenda online and do a refresh,
Thank you.
it will come up and then you can hit the link.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I am here, and I did send the email as well.
So probably it's just a
It
refresh.
might be from,
So I'll
it
give
might
you a
be from
second.
Lane County
to pull that
Agenda
up, but
Review.
Wait, I'm sorry, Diana, what?
I did send an email with an attachment as well, and it might be from Lane County Agenda Review, not Diana.
I see it on the website with the refresh. Thank you.
Yes, me too. Thank you, Commissioner Bozovich.
So it's a board memo with just a few slight updates. The previous order that you've approved, and the substantive change is there's a new number 3 added. So there were 3 whereas before, now, or 3 now therefore, there's now 4. The new 3 says the county administrator is authorized to respond to any requests for authority that require attestation or approval by the Board of Commissioners, to respond to issues regarding this emergency. The county administrator shall report any actions taken pursuant to this authority at the next regularly scheduled meeting of the Board of Commissioners. So that we're adding this language that just again, out of an abundance of caution, the confusion created is you all received an email from the governor's office asking for you to send a response. The individual commissioners don't have the authority to do that. As a board, you have to meet in this forum to take that action. So it actually would be a violation of public meeting. You all are very up to speed and wonderful about this, that none of you responded to that. You all forwarded it to me and sort of said, what's the process? What do we do? So good on you for following that rule. And what we wanted to do here was just say that really this is a technical process that the governor's office is, and I'm going to respond, Commissioner Burney and I will respond to the governor's office, say, 36 counties in Oregon, they're all different. Not all of them have appointed executives via county administrator where the board delegates authority to do certain things. And so we understand that, but the challenge, of course, is we don't want to create all the confusion and hassle for everyone that has resulted here. And it's a really easy process for us to work through our emergency operations team and say, are we at the place that we're ready to move to group 6, which is frontline workers? We talked to the board about this yesterday, so you're well aware. Frontline workers are eligible on Monday. We had a similar process last week that happened. We said we're ready to move to 45 to 64-year-olds with underlying medical conditions. The board was down, and the chair doesn't have that authority. Individual commissioners don't have the authority. The board didn't have a meeting, and so I sent a letter to the governor, and then I forwarded it to all the commissioners, brought up in the meeting yesterday. And so we just want to formalize that process and be really clear about, as we move, this is happening almost each week, we're moving into new groups, that will be much smoother for the governor and her staff and for our team here in Lane County to go ahead and do that. So that's what this action would be. And happy to answer any questions that you might have, but we're asking you to take action on that updated board order.
I think that this updated court order clarifies what we did not know was an issue in communications that we all received apparently yesterday. I thought they were trying to bait me to speak for the board without speaking to the board, and I didn't want to get in trouble. Is there any discussion on this before we have a motion? And we can always discuss this after the motion. Do I hear a motion? Commissioner Buck.
I'll move approval of order 21-03-31-01 in the matter of extending the declaration of local emergency as a result of the public health response to COVID-19.
I'll second.
Sorry, Commissioner Bozovich, you were iced out of that one. It has been proposed, excuse me, let me just read the order. Order 21-03-31-01 in the matter of extending the declaration of a local emergency as a result of public health response to COVID-19 has been moved by Commissioner Buck, seconded by Commissioner Trieger. Is there discussion to the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Let the record show that order 21-03-31-01, proposed by Commissioner Buck, seconded by Commissioner Trieger, is unanimously approved 5-0. Mr. Mokraheisky, I believe we are through that. Do you have anything else for us?
That's it. Thank you.
Do any commissioners have any other business? This has been a long 2-day meeting. Now we're free to get to work. Thank you all very much. Have a great day.
Hey, Steve, can you stay on the line for a second?